Well, firstly, thanks very much for everyone for joining the SFI Australia Connect webinar series today with our international keynote speaker, Ron Bettin. For those who don't know me, my name is Mark Wall and I'm the Head of Marketing and Innovation with SFI Australia. Before we get underway and I introduce Ron, I wanted to highlight our goal behind the SFI Connect webinar series. For most of us online, we find ourselves in the day-to-day struggle that is planning construction and shutdown projects, often with little time to connect and actually learn from industry peers. This is what the SFI Connect webinar series aims to achieve, connecting recognized thought leaders with industry experts like yourselves to help drive efficiency, innovation, continuous improvement on your next turnaround or construction project. Throughout the year, we aim to connect you with exceptional leaders in the field and really hope to provide value in what you do and how you do it. We really encourage feedback through the webinar series, and if you have ideas or suggestions of people you would like to hear from, please feel free to reach out to the SFI team. Our theme this month, as you know, is efficiency, and efficiency takes many forms. At SFI, we are efficient at procurement. We're efficient at mobilizing tool stores and providing efficiency through innovation. But efficiency means different things to everyone and different things to the people that are actually on this webinar today. Personally, to me, efficiency is all around solving a problem and improving a process. When we address an issue, we can't help but be more efficient. And this applies to all of our businesses and all of the projects that we're involved in. A perfect example of this is SFI's ability to mobilize a 40-foot tool store within a single shift. This leads to huge cost savings and a better bottom line for your project or construction. Today, though, we are here to talk to Ron Bettin, a business leader and president of Ajuco, who will explore his top 4 tips to improving efficiency through improved stakeholder engagement, in particular on complex maintenance and construction projects. Oh, I should say shutdown projects as well, Ron. I can see Ron nodding to my side and I'll share his screen very shortly. You will notice before we start a Q&A section at the top of the page. This is where you can ask questions and we will obviously come back to these questions at the end of the session. We do only have 45 minutes, so we'll obviously have to move through a few slides rather fast, but we do encourage you to reach out after these sessions as well. So Ron, I will obviously share your screen in a minute, but I first met Ron at the Perth Shutdowns, Turnarounds and Outages Conference in 2024. And now I pass to Ron, who I believe you're in Calgary, Alberta in Canada. Is that correct, Ron?
I am. Yep. Yes, I am in Calgary.
Fantastic. I'll pass the screen over to yourself and welcome to the SFI Connect webinar series.
Good. Well, thank you, Mark, and thanks to SFI for having me. I really and I really enjoy talking to people around the world, and I have spent some time in Australia, and for any who've spent time in Canada, a lot of similarities. So I know I'm not sitting in Australia. A lot of things I'll talk about should be pretty familiar to people there. So yeah, with that, and maybe I'll just share my screen, and maybe Mark can just make sure it shows up there.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got that nice and clearly. Thanks, Ron.
Excellent. Good. Well, again, thanks again. And I got lots of things to talk about, share about stakeholders. So I'm going to zip through quite a few slides, but I'm actually going to try and keep this more high level. There'll be more pictures than words because I really think actually some of the concepts we don't expect everybody to remember everything, but if you can just get a few nuggets out of this would be valuable actually. And I believe this is being recorded, so if there's something that just stood out, maybe you can get back and rewatch it again for fun and entertainment. So good. And with that, I'm just going to move some windows around here and get going. So I'm going to talk about tips for improving efficiency of complex projects through stakeholder engagement. That said, a lot of things I talk about apply to just about any part of your world. If you're involved in any industrial maintenance, operation, or projects, you'll find some of these things familiar that I talk about. So just a bit about me. So I primarily spent a lot of my career in the oil and gas industry, worked around energy projects in North America, US, Ecuador, and the UK, and I've done a little bit of work in Australia. I'm now the principal of Aduco Consulting, and I've had about 25 years of plus of leadership experience, and it's covered everything from doing large energy startups. I've done more than 12 large shutdowns, turnarounds, including the fact that I've had the opportunity to start up some companies. So I'm not an expert at anything, but I have to say along my career, I've got a lot. I've become an expert at people, and what I have learned, I'm going to share with you today some of my learnings around stakeholders, because I really think that's important and can make a big difference. Um, before this goes too far, you really need some stakeholder input. You know what? And that I totally agree with. The project world, it's all about goals, deliverables, tasks, and we can get pretty focused on getting stuff done. However, what I've learned along the years is some of the whenever things go wrong, it's not necessarily a task that went wrong. It had something to do with people and stakeholders. So I also believe that some of the biggest opportunities are around people and stakeholders. So we're going to talk a bit about that today. I know you probably hear from me more, but I want to feel a bit more like a discussion. So definitely, if you have questions or input, please chime in, and we'll cover them during the presentation or at the end. So let's talk a bit about project management. Specifically, I'm going to talk about shutdowns and turnarounds. And I think everybody's involved, but you can take this for around any industrial plant. Usually there's the project manager assigned to this, and we got a project team. However, most of those projects do not get done without some key stakeholders, and those can be from anywhere. So you either have project team as your stakeholder, internal groups can be your stakeholder, external groups, and the one stakeholder that a lot of project teams forget about is senior leadership, because they think that usually comes down from the top to them. But I want to talk a bit about what senior management's leadership's role as well. So all your stakeholders, they can either have a positive influence on your project, or of course they have a negative. Most of the time you find out stakeholder issues on the negative side. Again, I want to focus about some of the positive things, but to get things, started right, if you don't start with good engagement and get some stakeholder engagement early on in the project, you just start to build barriers and walls in your project. And that becomes pretty critical later on. Sometimes these little walls become big ones later on when the projects get critical, or a lot more things on site, people on site, and especially when you get into a shutdown where all of a sudden it becomes very intense. However, really good engagement, it really ensures support for the project. You can actually get decisions made quicker, and it really increases the probability of success. And those things are intangibles. Or if any of you have been in a big project, sometimes just getting a decision made can cost you a lot of money, and the whole project a lot of money. So having good stakeholder engagement, including all the people around their leadership, external groups, really leads to some efficiencies around decision making and support for your project. So we're going to talk a bit about complex projects specifically, and I say complex projects and then we're going to dig it into a bit of the around shutdowns and outages, but really you can apply this to anywhere. And complex projects, one of the characteristics of them is they have multiple stakeholders, and generally one of the characteristics about complex projects is you can have some stakeholders are pretty complex. So I don't know if you have any had three-headed dogs, but it feels like sometimes I bet on projects some of your stakeholders feel like that. So again, the nature of complex projects is the number of interactions and the number of components in the project. So this would be familiar to some of you there. And as you get more complex, you really start to increase the risk. So this is why stakeholder is important, because the risk, you're really increasing the risk if you don't manage your stakeholders. So a few of the things, attributes of a complex project, they have many constraints, lots of interdependencies, uncertainty around the project. There's things that you just don't know until you start the project. And then sometimes you're applying some innovation and technology, and of course you have multiple stakeholders. So again, I'm going to focus around shutdowns and outages and turnarounds, because these are complex projects. And I argue that no matter how big some of the projects are in the world, I still believe some of the most complex projects are turnarounds and outages and shutdowns, because because of those levels of complexities that you have to deal with. So let's talk about them completely. And just from a terminology point of view, I'll probably use the acronym STOW, shutdown, turnaround, outages. I know each company, each industry, even geographically, will use different terms and they have slightly different meanings. However, what I can tell you is that most of them are complex for those reasons we talked about. So in that view, let's talk about typical STOW. And this is the one part that I think a lot of people involved in an outage don't understand. They understand the different components. So let's walk through a typical shutdown. Will have 3 different groups. You'll have your operations group, right? That most of the, whatever you are, whether it's a mine, a power plant, a petroleum plant, most of them will have day-to-day operations. And those people, for most of the time, they operate on their own world. They're doing their operations, and they become a component when you have a shutdown. Another component is the maintenance group, right? So you have day-to-day maintenance through the year, and when you have an outage, all of a sudden they're a component of your outage. Inspections, that's a huge part of a lot of outages because you don't get to do full inspections till sometimes you can shut the equipment down and look at it. And also a lot of the inspections really drive the main activities of your event. And then the other component, and I don't know who's all on the screen, but some of you will come from the project and capital work side, and you got a lot of work to do, and then you have to try and coordinate an outage or a shutdown, and they're a pain in the ass. You just want to keep working along, and now all of a sudden you got to integrate with a different group. So now, if it wasn't complex enough, most of those 4 groups for most of the time get to work independently. Now you got to start bringing together, and some of the complexities around that are you start to bring operations, and then typically project work, you have simultaneous operations, right? That's a new world for a lot of people who aren't around operating equipment, operating plants, and it becomes a complicated and a lot of bureaucracy for a lot of people. However, it's all built around safety. So that's a complexity. Access to equipment. If you're going to start bringing stuff down and doing inspections, all of a sudden you're going through a non-routine activity in operations to make sure it's ready for inspections. Of course, you do inspection, you have found work. So I say these are projects within projects, because a lot of times you find work, you can kind of anticipate it, but you don't really know what that project is till you actually find it. And then if you're during an outage, you have to get that work done before the outage ends. So it can be pretty complex there. And of course, the logistics side of it. So generally, a large capital projects will have cranes around and exclusive use to them. When you're in the middle of an outage, all of a sudden you have to start sharing cranes. You have 2 cranes and 6 jobs. What's the priority? What are you going to get done? You have 6 jobs that have to do in a certain area. Everybody needs the same tools and equipment, so logistics become complicated. And right in the middle is the project management team. And I have a lot of time for project management teams because these are teams that have the most complicated projects. And just about every company I'm at, they really have to manage by influence, because each of those main groups around the side generally have their own org structure. They have their own leaders. They generally have their own way of actually making decisions. And during an outage, that project team has to bring them all together. So if there's ever a case to have good stakeholder engagements, it's during outage and turnaround, where you have to bring all these different stakeholder groups together and try to meet deadlines and be as efficient as you can. So because all those groups come from different areas, and I suspect even on this call, each one of you could probably identify with one of those groups, or you're the project manager. Let's talk about it, because a lot of people don't know how other people do work. So part of being a good stakeholder engagement is understanding the other people. So let's talk about the typical cycle of work for a maintenance stakeholder perspective. And I'm going to have a little fun with these slides, so I'm not purposely going to offend anybody. However, some will be funny, and some you might go, oh, I understand that. So I've seen that. So and let's talk about maintenance stakeholder perspective. So generally maintenance work, you have a scope of work, you plan it, you schedule it, you execute it, and that gets done, and you get another scope of work. So kind of in the life cycle of maintenance work, it's every week you get a new set of projects, and you just have a nice little rhythm week to week, right? And that just carries on through a whole year. So so what does a maintenance problem look like? It usually involves one piece of equipment, usually a person, a procedure, a process, sometimes a tool. Clearly, this example has all of those issues going on. Lucky there's a good supervisor who'll sort that out, right? So let's move on to an operations stakeholder perspective. So when you're operating any type of plant, generally you want it to be smooth and steady. So typically, the work cycle of operations is to operate steady. There'll be some sort of event that disrupts, and the entire goal is to get back to steady state operations. So the rhythm of work for an operator is kind of steady in spikes. You'll notice that there's some spikes are bigger than others. I was focused on the one at the end, turnarounds and outages and shutdowns. That's a huge abnormal event for operations. Takes a lot of extra effort. But generally, what does an operations problem look like? Well, they usually start out small. Things are going along, there's a little hiccup, and then things just start to crash, and the whole place goes down. They have one goal, to get everything stacked up again and flatline. So that is been the cycle of operations. Turnarounds are not much different. They just want to get that thing done, over, back, smooth. That goes just about for every type of industry that I'm in. And some cycles, every week they may have an outage, every month, every 6 months, sometimes it's every few years if it's a big refinery. However, the goal is to get things back up and flatlined again, smooth. So let's talk about inspections. They're a huge part of any of these outage and shutdown work. So it's a pretty familiar thing, a lot like maintenance work, right? You inspect and you find some work, you put a plan together, you schedule it, you repair it, and then you start over again. The rhythm, though, is it's not quite steady every week. It kind of goes in spurts, because you'll find things, you put a plan together. Sometimes you can do things online. Sometimes you have to take a piece of equipment off and work on it and do repairs. Sometimes for inspections where you really have to get inside things, that little bump at the end is really reflecting another turnaround situation. So it comes in quite large packages of work, but the path to get there is pretty clear. We already talked about this. Sometimes when you find that work, the repair process becomes a project within a project, because now we have a deadline to do something with it, right? So what does an inspection project look like? An inspection problem look like? Well, oh my goodness, it's a crisis, because you didn't know you had a problem until you found the problem. Now you got to deal with the problem, and as sound work during turnaround, it is pretty dramatic sometimes. So not to offend any inspection people, but I know lots of people kind of roll their eyes, go, "Oh no, we found something," right? So there's a bit of drama sometimes around inspections and found work there. However, pretty key part of your turnaround projects. Capital works, that fourth circle we talked about, it's really a pretty predictable type of work, right? You have scope, you plan it, you schedule it, you execute it. And as big as they can be, there's kind of a pattern that happens, right? They're smaller, you build, you complete that project, and you're done. Move on to the next project, right? So what does, the only thing around project is they have some constraints that a lot of us don't have, is time and cost, because right from the day one of that, they usually have a budget, and they have to meet that schedule and cost. And generally the problem with turnarounds is sometimes they'll fall in the middle of that. And so what does a capital project problem look like? It generally means cash. Whenever a project manager has something else come along, the first thing they think, what's that going to cost me, and how much am I going to do it, and is that going to be a change order, and what's going to be involved in getting this done? So they like pretty predictability, because anything outside of that generally adds up dollars that were not budgeted. So that's about the capital project side. Now I want to talk about that group in the middle, the project shutdown managers, or the shutdown team there. Don't they have a handful, but they actually have a project plan schedule as well, and they have a typical cycle of work, and it is quite different than a lot. It looks a lot like capital work. You have a scope, you have a plan, you have a schedule, and you execute. Their dilemma is that it's a bit of a sleeper, because you're doing a lot of work for a long time, and then it hits all at once. And typically in a shutdown, you you have all kinds of constraints because definitely time, you generally lost production. So time is huge. You're out. We lost revenues, cost. Costs are huge because everybody wants a defined budget and there's all kinds of unknown work during an outage. And scope, how difficult scope is, right? If anybody's been a turnaround or shutdown manager, you spend months and months trying to lock down your scope, and it always happens that there's additional scope, late scope, and then found work. So it's a really difficult job. I have another presentation I do affectionately called why turnarounds are the middle figure of project management. Can anybody guess why? Uh, it's fairly obvious, actually. Anyways, not to discourage turnaround managers because you are needed, and I'll put a plug in for anyone who manages turnaround shutdowns because you really do have the most complex. And what does a shutdown project problem look like? Well, it can be a train wreck because you're going smooth all that time. You're planning. You really don't know what's going to hit you till that actual turnaround hits. And it could be found work, it could be a labor disruption, anything, but you're under such time constraints and cost and scope constraints. It is a train wreck sometimes. So how does a STO manager engage with stakeholders when they are so busy leading up to a turnaround event? There's all those activities, capital project maintenance, inspections, operations activities going along, and nobody is focused on your turnaround event because it's kind of a sleeper until you actually get there. So we're going to talk about that, and I think the answer truly is stakeholder engagement because I've been brought into quite a few turnarounds early. And the primary purpose is to get stakeholders engaged, get a sense of importance to what's going on, or otherwise it's not, if it's not in sight, it's not on mind, right? And it's always something out there till it's there. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to engage stakeholders, and I want to talk a bit about important versus urgent. And I think this is really important. This is a real concept because if any one of these, I'm going to go through a bit of these steps, a classic, and there's very versions of this stage gate plan, but in general, you want to put your strategy and scope together. For some shutdowns, that could be years in advance. Some it can be months. However, generally, you want to put your strategy and scope together, detailed planning, then you have your pre-work phase and your shutdown event, and then you want to do some post-work. You always have post-work, and ideally you do a review. However, what are your stakeholders doing? So way out there, if you're planning one a year in advance, you know what? They don't care, right? They got other things to do. They're busy doing their thing. They don't care. You get into detailed planning, you need subject matter experts to participate. What? Well, they're too busy. So the very point you do detailed planning where you want those subject matter experts, they're busy doing other things. And that stakeholder engagement is tough because if anybody been there, your success, your turnaround is dependent on them, and they're nowhere to be found when you need them. Pre-work, that's when the stakeholders start to panic because all of a sudden it's right on the doorstep, and all those things that could have, should have, would have been involved in are now imminent, and can be some real panic then. And then, of course, during the event, that's when you really get stakeholder input because anything that didn't go right is they're going to find someone to blame, and they'll all come all kinds of solutions for you then. So that stakeholder input's a little too late. And then, of course, if you're doing a shutdown or outage, everybody's exhausted. So when it's over, they're ready for holidays or go and do something else. So when you really need them to do reviews, they're ready to move on. And that is a dilemma at most locations because in the eyes of many people, it's over. And then they go on to do their other things. So that's another critical part. I'm not going to dwell much in it, but I think anybody who's been through a large, complex STO understands this and can relate. So let's talk a bit about it there and what happens. So I really want to talk about urgent versus important. I use this all the time because if you can't describe what's important and what's urgent, then you actually end up doing the wrong thing. So what is not urgent, not important? Sitting around scrolling, doom scrolling through your phone and looking on TikTok is probably not important, not urgent, although it takes up so much of people's time, right? So that's a quadrant we don't want to be in. We have things that are not important but urgent. How many computers have stopped working right when you need it? It's not the end of the world. However, it's kind of an urgent crisis, and you end up fighting those crises all the time. Where we end up with a lot of projects is that world of very urgent, very important, that firefighting world. And that does happen. In fact, you have to, if you have found work and things like that, you have to accommodate it. The last thing you want to do is go into an outage, is basically going in there planning on being in the very urgent and very important square. What you really want to do for good projects, the happy place for an SDO manager and a project team is to make things very important before they become urgent. And I'm going to talk more about that because so many times, and I'll say there's a huge role for senior leadership to get involved, because we talked earlier, back when we could not get people involved in turnaround planning and outage planning, is that's when it's most important. So there's a role for leaders to get involved and really add some importance before things become urgent, right? So let's talk through a bit about this, and I'm just going to go through a few paths, and you'll recognize some of these. The path to a shutdown of last minute planning. Well, it's urgent right from the time you start defining your scope. You're planning when it's urgent. Your pre-work is done, and it's a panic right to the shutdown event. And you know what? That's a good path to a train wreck. I bet you, if you've been in the industry here, you at all in any industry, you've been in this situation where you know it's coming, and you're pulled on so many priorities, and the last minute you're trying to plan it. The other path to a shutdown is where planning is not important. So, you're starting 2 years early and kind of doing a strategy and scope, but nobody's really getting fully engaged. You're kind of doing a detailed plan, but your subject matter experts aren't fully available. Well, then it starts getting close. Now you're getting into the urgent territory, and now you're trying to do all the pre-work and everything without everything complete. You have your shutdown event. That's another path to a train wreck. So what do you want to do with stakeholders, right? You want stakeholders fully to understand your project. Back when things aren't urgent, they are still important. So your strategy and scope, it's not urgent, it's out early, it's very important. Detailed planning, turnarounds, your shutdown's still a ways away, but that detailed planning, because that's going to make the difference in how successful you are in your event. Pre-work, right? That's important. You can't forget about the little details. In fact, if you plan them well, your pre-work is really going to set you up for success, and you're going to have a successful shutdown. In fact, it'll be just a super pit stop, a super efficient pit stop. Everybody's working as a team in unison. And if you find something, you know what, you actually can plan for the things that you find, because everyone else knows exactly what their roles are. So that is a successful path. And I think that probably, if you take one thing away, is back before things become urgent, keep them important if you're doing project planning, and make sure your stakeholders understand the importance, or you're putting your project at risk. Okay, let's talk about interest and influence, because you know what? Sometimes a shutdown manager, you're kind of buried in an organization, and you're given that task. You're in the middle of all of those stakeholders, and you're given a task to get this thing done and make it successful. Well, you only have a certain amount of influence as a manager or project team, or you'll pick yourself wherever you're at. You only have a certain amount of influence and control, right? You have to start to think about the people you're there. And complex projects are going to have all kinds of group, whether it's contractors, other groups in your company, accounting, you name it, service providers, tools, all that stuff. These are all the people, and some of them may or may not be in your influence and control. And one thing I talk a lot to really any manager, I coach a lot of leaders and managers, is learning to manage up, because you can only influence who you can influence. You can only control who you control. However, if you want to be more successful, you have to manage up. You have to engage more. Leaders above you have higher level of influence, and they can really help ensure alignment. And in a lot of projects, if they get big enough and there's a big enough stakeholder group, that's when you start to bring in like a steering committee. And I know a lot of people will think, oh, that steering committee is a pain in the ass, right? They just stop me from doing things. However, you flip that around. If you're in a role where you're dependent on a steering committee, you should be feeding up them tasks, because you need them. They have the influence. They can get things done, right? And then if it's, in a big organization, if you're having an event that requires this really complex project, and there's a lot of interactions, sometimes outside of the company, you really need to go right up to senior leadership, and they have to be involved. And the one thing you hear lots is that my boss doesn't understand, or leaders don't understand. I want anyone on this call to just take responsibility, because if your leader doesn't understand what's going on, part of your responsibility is to manage that stakeholder, manage up, because all those people above wherever you're at, they are actually stakeholders in the success of your project. And most of them, they want you to be successful. And the only way they can help out is to actually understand what's going on. So a bit about leadership too is, you know what, a senior leader can make strategic decisions, right? And sometimes around your project or event, it may be independent. It may be dependent on the economics, the environment, all kinds of things that are beyond your control. You need those senior leaders involved because they really can help make strategic levels. Mid-level leaders, they really help with value-based decisions. So, you know, sometimes that, you know, if only the company would spend more time on training, we'd all be better. Well, it's the mid-level managers and that level who actually have the authority and the ability to make value decisions, to spend money, to save money, to spend money to make more efficient, to spend time to do things better. That's mid-level of management to really have that capacity. So you need to engage them. You know, if you're working at anywhere at the frontline level, most of the time you can control cost and your activity decisions. But if you want to be strategic or make value decisions, you really need to move up your influence chain or up the chain of stakeholders there. And I don't know who's all on the call, but if you're actually at any of those senior levels, make sure you understand that some of those people you've tasked doing things really need you to be successful. So find ways to get engaged with them to help them be successful, and understand that if it's about strategy or value-based decision, they need that senior leadership support. So what to do with that information? Let's talk a bit about how you manage your stakeholders and interest versus influence. So we talked a bit about where on the hierarchy. However, projects are different. All those people kind of fit in there. However, to be successful, you really need to understand your stakeholders. So this matrix here talks a bit about the different types of them. So we have promoters. These people with high interest and high influence, right? Those are people you want to keep regularly engaged and keep them satisfied. You have observers, right? They have high interest because they're dependent on it, but they have low influence. So that would be even some of your workers, right? Some of the contract crews, they can't really make a big change on how you do it, but boy, their success depends on it. So you need to inform them and really monitor them completely. There's the latents. These are people who have low interest, low influence. They sometimes can be a time sucker because it turns out they're the ones who actually use up a lot of your time. You know, so it's just essential to actually monitor them and maybe give them some information. And if anything changes, but really careful how much time you spend with them. The defenders, these are people with low interest and high influence, right? So an example of that would be a regulator, an auditor, safety sometimes, right? So these people, you have to be in touch regularly and anticipate their needs. So if you have a safety inspection coming on, then you should be understanding what's required of the safety inspection, because they may go from site to site, but on your site, they may come down and shut you down. So those are the people you got to watch, because they can throw bombs into your project. So a whole lot of background, some pictures. I'm going to stop and kind of let you absorb it a bit, because what I talked about was a lot about understanding the stakeholders, understanding how much influence they have, and how they can help your projects, and then really categorize them. But I think actually what I'd like to do now is just do a bit of a case study here. So I don't know, I picked a case study out of the blue around tools, equipment, consumable management for shutdown turnarounds and construction projects. I don't know if there's some people on the line who know anything about that or rely on tools and equipment for their projects, but I think this is a pretty familiar story everywhere, and it might be pretty close to home for people on this call. So hopefully it resonates and we can apply some of this learnings here. So I happen to pick a SFI store facility. I'm going to apologize because I didn't get a lot of time to talk as SFI about this, so it could be a surprise to some of you. I pulled everything off the website, so if it sounds like you SFI, then that's great, and if it doesn't, then I clearly misinterpreted what was on the website. But for those who are and definitely SFI, they have temporary storage facility powered by Monitor logistics systems, ensures seamless tool, equipment, and consumable management for shutdowns, turnarounds, construction projects with real-time tracking, automated compliance, and optimized inventory control. You reduce downtime, control cost, enhance safety, keeping projects on schedule within budget, and you do that with a mobile or permanent stores facility, has all your required tools, equipment, industrial supplies, and it will monitor your logistics management system. Or does it have a system called Monitor, which does all your material logistic management system? Slam dunk, right? Everybody should want this. Every stakeholder should say, that's what I need, right? I don't think it's the case, right? Not because it's not a good idea, not because it doesn't add value, but there are a lot of stakeholders, because I think when you're talking about people's tools, it gets pretty personal. When you're talking about changing their process, it gets personal, right? So so let's talk about all those things we talked about. Let's talk about and I'm going to give you some examples. This is not all in detail, but some ideas of understanding stakeholder engagement can help the decision to use a temporary store facility. And I'm going to use this, obviously, because it actually fits the case in SFI. However, what I'm going to talk about applies to just about any major change, any big stakeholder involvement in a outage and turnaround. So back to that, all the players involved, right? If you're doing an outage, shutdowns and turnarounds are complex. So if you're not doing anything that's going to reduce the complexity for stakeholders, you're probably not helping out. The last thing anyone needs, specifically the project management team, is to make things more complex. So how can an SFI solution reduce complexity for all those stakeholders? Well, let's kind of go through it. I'm kind of pull out the website, and then if you may have some other exemplar project in mind, but you really want to do is look at your stakeholders, see how will that make a difference, right? So the workers and contracts have easy access to tools, equipment for preventing project delays, right? So there's something that resonates to people. They want to prevent project delays. Simplifies coordination for the project team by ensuring real-time tracking of tools, equipment, and consumables. You know what? That project team has a lot on the go, right? You look at all those circles and overlaps. If you can do things that simplify, that's going to help that project team. Supervisor can be sure tools and equipment are in proper condition to minimize downtime. So you want to connect with the supervisor, because they're the ones that have to make this whole project work and get done. So that having good equipment is good for that. Procurement and supply chain, they can be sure to streamline sourcing and inventory management, right? I've been in a lot of projects, and no matter how many processes you put in place, if you have a lot of processes, it can get out of control pretty quick. So especially you can actually get projects like this, you can get competing. You're all working on the same project, but you can actually start to compete on some of your procurement and supply chain, which is even worse, right? Safety department, right? They have one thing in goal in mind is to make sure that everybody's safe, and the one of the levers they have is around to make sure people have good, safe tools. So that's the stakeholders important. Real-time cost tracking can be more efficient for the accounting team and cost control. And that's huge, because sometimes that just gets left in the dust during projects, the accounting and project control. And then after you do a look back, you go, man, I wish we had simplified ways of doing that. And I've been on so many projects. Part of look back was how we could have got better cost tracking, and how many projects just scrapped it halfway through. So there's a stakeholder that we keen on it. You know what? In leadership, senior leadership has, that overall they may not be directly the project, but understanding the risk around projects is huge, because that's where leaders can play a big role, is understanding risk and help mitigate risk. So leaders actually might even be a stakeholder in this type of store facility. So that's the aspect of understanding how we can reduce complexity. So another efficiency tip, engage key stakeholders in important strategy and planning before it becomes an urgent. And I'm sure some of you, when I showed that the stage gate plan, can totally relate that all best intentions to get people involved early, it just doesn't happen, and you always find out during the middle of an outage where that engagement didn't happen. So let's talk about how SFI could engage with key stakeholders in strategy and planning. I'm going to say this applies to any major strategic change that you're going to do in your projects. It's almost the same bullet. So strategy and scope phase. It really requires collaboration with the clients. So this would be from an SFI perspective. You have to be there at the table during the scope requirements and finding out what they require in the metrics, right? And that goes both ways, the project team as well, because you got to get aligned early on in the strategy. You got to engage with the project management. You got to understand the risk, because if people don't understand the risk of making a change, then you really set yourself up for failure. And you got to start proposing things early on that will fit. It's a fit for purpose solution to the project leaders. They have to understand that this is going to work for them. Sometimes that takes a lot of effort because it's changing not just one group, it's changing like all 4 of the groups that are involved. Detailed planning, what can you do? Collaborate with the project team to define tools, equipment lists, right? Be right involved in the risk review with stakeholders. Get that IT system set up. Ensure tools meet safety tests and are compliant. Back when you're planning, just understand all those requirements. Moving to pre-work, right? This is pretty important, right? Sometimes this is only when this stuff starts, is right at pre-work, and then you find out all the stuff you should have done. So you coordinate mobilization with project logistics. That's huge, right? You want to be at the right time, the right place, and get things in. Conduct training, make sure on the process, align and test the process. You don't want to be into an outage or shutdown and finding out if your workflow systems. You want to test that ahead of time. Test it with the key stakeholders because they're the ones that are going to push back or make it successful. And get required sign off on safety compliance. Huge. So that's tip number 2. Going through this fairly fast. And then tip number 3, stakeholder registry engagement plan is valuable. Talked a bit about this, and I'm going to actually get really practical. Everybody on a project, you should understand who your promoters are. They're the managers, supervisors, HSE people, senior leadership. You got regular meetings, custom reports, and access data. Your observers, right, of high interest, maintenance teams, operations teams, contractors, all those people. You need training sessions, user guidelines, updates and alerts. Those people, she's already planned in place what you're going to do for them. Latent people, HR department, some manufacturers, community, insurance provider, people from other projects. They just want to know everything that's going on. You know, you might want to do periodic updates, find a report that works for them. Optional training, manage those people because they can take a lot of your time. And most importantly, some of the defenders, you got regulatory bodies, auditors, legal department, risk management department, corporate oversight officers. Those people, schedule audits, get engaged with them, know when they're coming, schedule updates and do status updates and reports. So make sure you put a plan in place. I'd encourage every project to do that. Have a risk registry or a stakeholder registry and have an engagement plan, and you'll be way better off on that. Last tip, and this is where I'm going to wrap it up. Been burning through this pretty fast. Hopefully you're keeping up. My last tip, and it's kind of a general tip, and it's my final thoughts. You know what? Stakeholder engagement starts at the top. Senior leadership, so I don't know who's all on this call, but if you're the most senior in your organization, really help with stakeholder engagement, and you got to help engage all the way down, and you got to really put things in place so people can engage up so that the right decisions can be made by the right people with the right information. And effective project leaders, they don't just manage tasks, they really build relationships. And outages and projects can get pretty intense. And if you don't have good relationships, intensity doesn't make them better. Anybody who's on a really good project, intensity, when it's done, people will go, wow, I just love working with that team. And that was tough, but boy, that was good. If they don't have good relationships, they'll never work with each other again, and they almost sabotage your project. So super important. And to wrap it up, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And with that, I think I'm just in my 45 minutes there. So I'd like to thank all of you who joined us today. If I talk too fast, you can put the recording on slow and listen to it after. And I do believe SFI would be willing to contact you again after. And thank you guys for your time.
Thank you, Ron. It's greatly appreciated, and we're getting a bit of a virtual applause from some of the attendees. So thanks very much for everyone for obviously jumping online. We might spend maybe 5 minutes just asking a bit of Q&A, and if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A tab. But Ron, one thing I was thinking of during that presentation is obviously there are hundreds of stakeholders. We're talking about big construction projects, big shutdowns, turnarounds, a lot of complexity there with planning starting, as you said, 2 to 3 years out and in advance. What are some of the practical tips you can give to some of those stakeholders, be it senior level, mid or entry level, if they're struggling to get engagement from the teams above them? Are there any tips and tricks? Is it just continuous meetings, one-on-ones? What would you suggest to those guys struggling?
Yeah, no, it's good. And there's some stuff I left out for time, but there's a couple things you can really define right up front. So one, any big project should have a project charter or a premise document right at the beginning. and right in there talk about how you're going to do stakeholder engagement, who the key stakeholders are, and especially if it's just strategic, how you're going to get them engaged. And that premise document should be signed off by your senior leaders, right? So in order to actually get them to sign off, you have to sit down and have that conversation about what it means. And then the next step to that is really encourage you to have a advisory team, a steering committee, something, because and so many times I've heard it, oh, I just can't get anything done because of the steering committee. And that's just the wrong way to think about it. Because if you've got a good premise document and you've really coached them, then you need that steering committee because you don't have the influence that they do. So if they're engaged and you're involving them, then they will help you deal with even senior leadership and other leadership that don't seem to get engaged because that's what they're there for, right? And I guess I can say if you're on a steering committee, then play your role, right? Your role is not to criticize the project team. You're really there to make them successful. So there's a bit, got a little soapbox. Did I preach a bit there?
Not at all. No, not at all. And one thing I'm noticing, there are a few comments coming through just to say thanks for your time, and a lot of people can relate to obviously the stories that you're sharing. I guess you travel a lot, you head around the world and speak at a lot of events. Is there anything that you're kind of seeing within the industry that is just really driving efficiency forward, and anything you can kind of relate to say, it's just a really innovative way to approach these kind of events?
Yeah, I mean, everybody talks about technology, right? So there'll be obviously drones and all the technology, and I completely argue technology without good implementation and good stakeholder engagement, right, may or may not be successful. All those cool things that you think are going to make a difference, start them early in the project, make them part of your project strategy, and then also do a risk register, right? Because if things don't work, you always need to understand how they are, and even new technology and efficiencies, and then having a good stakeholder, like part of doing registry. But I would say, challenge some things up front, because the one thing that happens, and the reason I show a bit of that org chart is because the people who are executing and kind of involved in the tasks, sometimes you have to spend money to really make big efficiencies. So if it's technology, if it's changing the process, if it's actually spending more money on planning, AI, those generally cost more money, right? So they're a value-based decision and could be a very strategic decision. So do them early on, because if you try to nickel and dime them, you're not actually going to get the value of them. So if you're going to use drones, you don't just go get a drone and see if it works. You actually very early on say, here's what I'm going to use the drones for. Here's what I want to get out of it. I'm going to put a plan in place. Oh, and if the drones don't work, then I have a backup plan, right? But if you're ready to execute and trying to do big efficiencies, you're probably going to fail because it's all strategy, people, and technology, right?
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. I am very conscious of time. We are around 5 minutes over our allocated time slot, but thank you very much, Ron. Your time is greatly appreciated, and look forward to obviously catching up with you again when you are back in Australia. And all the
Absolutely.
very best with the tariffs over there in Canada as well.
There's a problem I don't know if I can handle. I can solve, but I'll stick to projects and people.
You might need another hour for that conversation, but no, thank you for your time.
Exactly.
It's greatly appreciated, and I'm sure everyone online has found it very helpful. So thank you very much for everyone online, and we will, of course, send out a copy of this presentation as well. We'll talk to you soon at
Good.
the
Thanks.
next SFI Connect webinar series. Thank you.